I stood in the back of a church holding a stranger's hand, and not one person questioned it. His aunt grabbed both my hands and whispered, "Finally, someone who makes him smile again." His cousin called me good for him before I could say a single word. I opened my mouth to correct them every single time, and every single time I said nothing instead. What started as one afternoon of standing next to a grieving man so he wouldn't face his family alone turned into a will, a courtroom, a 6-year-old calling me almost mom, and a lie neither of us ever meant to keep. I still don't know if I was wrong. I stood in the back of St. Anthony's Church holding a stranger's hand, listening to people I'd never met call me such a comfort to Ethan, and all I could think was, none of you know my name is fake to you right now. 3 hours earlier, I'd been folding laundry in my 2-bedroom apartment, arguing with my daughter about why she couldn't wear her rain boots to school in July. Now I was being introduced as the girlfriend of a man I worked for at his mother's funeral, in front of his entire family, and I hadn't corrected a single person. That's the part I still think about, not that I lied. That I let it keep going, minute after minute, handshake after handshake, until it was too late to say it had ever been anything else. My name's Maya. I'm 31. I've got a 9-year-old daughter named Lily. And up until about 8 months ago, my life was about as unremarkable as it gets. I worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a daycare in the mornings, and one nannying a few afternoons a week for a guy named Ethan Cole. Ethan ran a mid-sized logistics company. His father had built from a single truck and a warehouse lease back in the 80s, and he was raising his daughter Grace alone after his wife left when Grace was 2 years old. He wasn't flashy about the money. Big house, sure, out past the good school district, but he drove a 5-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield he kept meaning to fix, and he packed his own lunches most days, which I always thought was kind of funny for a guy whose name was on the building downtown. I'd been divorced for 4 years myself. My ex, Danny, wasn't a bad guy. We just wanted different lives by the time Lily turned 5, and somewhere in the split I ended up with full custody and a mortgage I couldn't quite afford on my own. Nanning for Ethan 2 afternoons a week covered my car payment and then some, and it was easy work, mostly. Pick Grace up from 1st grade, help with homework, make sure she ate something besides goldfish crackers before dinner. Ethan and I barely talked beyond logistics. He'd come home around 6, say thanks for staying late, and I'd say no problem, grab my bag and go home to my own kid. I remember the first time I really talked to him, actually talked, was maybe 2 months into the job. Grace had a meltdown over a lost stuffed rabbit, and by the time Ethan got home, she'd cried herself into hiccups on the living room floor. He crouched down next to her instead of standing over her, which I noticed, and said, "Okay, tell me everything that happened, start to finish," in this very calm, very patient voice. Like he had all the time in the world, even though I knew he'd just come from a board meeting that ran 2 hours over. That was the first time I thought, this guy's actually trying, in a way a lot of people don't bother to. We fell into a rhythm after that. Small talk about Grace's teacher, about whether 5-year-olds needed screen time limits, about how neither of us could ever get takeout containers to stack right in the fridge. Nothing that felt like anything. I want to be honest about that part, because later everyone assumed there'd been some slow burn thing happening for months, and there wasn't. We were just 2 tired parents being polite to each other. Then his mother died. It was a stroke. Sudden, no warning. It's the kind of thing that happens on a Tuesday afternoon while she's watering plants in her sunroom, according to what Ethan told me later. He came to pick up Grace from my place that evening looking like someone had scraped him out from the inside. His hands were shaking slightly when he signed the little notebook I kept for pickup times, which was such a strange small detail to notice, but I noticed it. "You okay?" I asked, even though it was obviously a stupid question. He stood in my doorway for a long moment before he answered. "My mom passed this afternoon." I didn't know what to say, so I just said I was sorry and asked if he needed anything, expecting him to say no, thanks, and leave. Instead, he sort of laughed, this hollow, humorless sound, and said, "The funeral's Saturday. My whole family's going to be there. My aunts, my cousins, all of them, and they're going to ask why I'm alone again, why I haven't moved on, like grief has some kind of deadline. I don't have it in me to explain it for the 100th time, not this week. I didn't think it through, just said, 'Do you want me to come? Just so you're not standing there by yourself?' I don't have to say anything. I'll just be a person standing next to you." He looked at me for a second too long enough that I almost took it back and said, "Would you? Really?" I told him, of course, and I meant it exactly the way I said it. Moral support, warm body next to him, so he wasn't the only unpartnered person in a room full of coupled-up cousins. That was the entire plan. What I didn't account for was his Aunt Carol grabbing both my hands the second we walked into the reception hall and saying, "Oh, thank God, finally, someone who makes him smile again," before I could get a single word out edgewise. Or his cousin Danielle leaning over during the buffet line and whispering, "About time he moved on." Honestly, you're good for him. I can tell already. Every single time I opened my mouth to correct it, some polite version of, "Oh, we're not actually together. I just didn't want him to be alone today." And every single time I looked at Ethan's face and saw this small, tired relief settle into it. Like for once, nobody was asking him the question that actually hurt, and I just smiled instead and said nothing. By the end of the night, I'd been his girlfriend to roughly 40 people I would probably never see again in my life. On the drive home, Ethan apologized about 6 times. I should have corrected them. I don't know why I didn't. It's fine, I told him. One day doesn't matter. I actually believed that. One day, one small lie of omission, over and done the second we pulled into my driveway. Went inside, made Lily's lunch for the next day, and didn't think much more about it. I was wrong about that, and I found out how wrong about a week later. I got a phone call from a woman named Patricia Hain, who introduced herself as the estate attorney handling Ethan's mother's affairs. She asked if I could come into her office for the will reading that Thursday. I laughed, actually laughed into the phone, and told her there had to be some mix-up. I wasn't family. I was just the nanny. "Miss Torres," she said, very evenly, in the voice of someone who deals with confused, protesting people for a living, "you're named specifically in the document. I'd recommend you come in." I didn't sleep much before that appointment. I sat in Patricia's office 2 days later, with my stomach twisted into knots. Ethan across from me, looking just as blindsided as I felt, while she read through a trust his mother had apparently set up years earlier, meant for Grace's education and long-term future. More money than I'd seen in one place in my entire life. Buried in the legal language was a clause, an actual binding clause, stating the trust would only fully release to Ethan's control if he was in what the document called a stable, established partnership by the time Grace turned 7. Grace was going to turn 7 in 4 months. Ethan's face had gone pale gray by the time Patricia finished reading. "She never told me about this," he said. "Any of it." Patricia set the document down and folded her hands. "Your mother liked control, Mr. Cole, even from where she is now." I remember sitting in that leather chair thinking, clear as anything, this is the moment. This is where I say it right now, out loud. Actually, we're not together. I was just doing him a favor for one afternoon, and this whole thing ends here before it goes any further than a funeral guest list. I even opened my mouth. But Ethan turned to me in the hallway right after, before I could get the words out, and said, "I need to be clear. I am not asking you to keep this going because of some trust fund. I would never ask that of you." "I know you're not," I said, which, if I'm being honest with myself now, wasn't a no. It also wasn't a yes. It was me standing in a marble hallway, not saying anything at all. Again, for the second time in 2 weeks. I told myself, driving home that night, that I'd keep it going a little longer, purely for Grace's sake. That a trust meant to set a 7-year-old up for her whole education and future was worth a few more weeks of an awkward lie. And that felt like a good enough reason to live with for a while. What I didn't expect, what nobody warned me about, was how fast Grace herself latched on to the whole thing, faster and harder than any of the adults around her. She started asking me to braid her hair every single morning instead of just the 2 days I actually worked. She drew a picture for a school project called My Family, and it was her, Ethan, and me standing in front of their house. Stick figure sun overhead, and she brought it home so proud. I had to sit with my hands in my lap and just say, "That's beautiful, sweetheart," instead of anything true. One evening in early October, she had a full meltdown when I told her I had to head home to Lily, sobbing into the front of my shirt, saying, "You always leave. Everyone always leaves." And I held on to her small, shaking shoulders and told her I wasn't going anywhere. And in that specific moment, I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in years. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway watching that happen, and later, after Grace was finally asleep, he said quietly, "I'm sorry. None of this is fair to you." "She's a good kid," I said.
Oh, yeah.
It's not your fault she got attached to somebody who's around a lot. That's not entirely what I mean, he said, and didn't explain further, and I didn't push him to. Around that same stretch of weeks, things got more complicated from an entirely different direction. Ethan's ex-wife, Renee, who'd been mostly absent from Grace's life since she took a marketing position overseas 3 years earlier, resurfaced out of nowhere wanting partial custody reinstated. Her lawyer sent a letter that questioned Ethan's overall stability, specifically pointing at how quickly he'd apparently entered a new relationship following his mother's death, calling it erratic and concerning for the minor child's environment. Ethan showed me the letter across his kitchen table one night, his hands not quite steady. She hasn't called Grace in 8 months, he said. 8 months? And now she wants to use you, of all people, against me. Use me how, exactly? You're going to ask about you? About us? If this goes in front of a judge, which it might, I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because up until that point the lie had been contained mostly to family gossip at a reception hall and a single clause in a will.
Ow.
It was potentially going to be dissected in a courtroom. Not long after that, I learned that a board member at Ethan's company named Walter Greaves had started quietly asking around about who I actually was. Ethan told me, clearly embarrassed, that Walter had gone so far as to hire a private investigator, worried I might be some kind of opportunist positioning myself for the trust money. I felt genuinely sick hearing that, not so much because of the investigator himself, but because from the outside, laid out plainly, it did look exactly like that. A single mom with money troubles, a recently widowed CEO, a suspiciously well-timed relationship that started right around a funeral. I couldn't even fully blame Walter for connecting those dots the way he did. Somewhere in the middle of all that mess, something shifted in me that had nothing to do with the trust, or Grace, or any of the legal noise surrounding us. I started noticing the way Ethan rubbed his eyes when he was running on no sleep. The way he'd forget to eat dinner some nights because he was buried in Grace's school paperwork or a custody letter. The way he said thank you like he actually meant it every single time, never on autopilot. I wasn't playing pretend anymore when I found myself looking forward to those afternoons at his house. That scared me more than any lawyer's letter had. I brought it up to my sister on the phone one night, half laughing and half panicking at the same time. I think I actually like him. For real. Not for the story we're telling everyone, Maya. You are literally pretending to be this man's girlfriend because of a will. I'm aware of how it sounds. Does he know? Any of it? No, I admitted. She sighed, long and heavy. Then you need to figure out what you're actually doing here, and soon, before somebody besides you gets hurt too. I meant to talk to him about it honestly. I really did plan to. But before I found the moment, Ethan came to me with an offer that knocked the wind clean out of me. He sat across the table, looking uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and said, I want to start paying you, consulting fee, through the custody hearing at least. It isn't right that you're doing all of this, dealing with my family, my ex, all of it, for free. He thought he was being considerate. I understood that much later once I'd calmed down. But in that exact moment it felt like he'd reached directly into my chest and pulled out every feeling. I'd been carefully not naming and stamped a price tag right on top of it. Said, sure, yeah, that makes sense, in a voice that sounded normal to my own ears, and then I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, crying before I could pull myself together enough to walk inside to Lily. That was probably the lowest point of the entire thing for me. Not because of the money itself, because I realized I'd let myself want something that was never supposed to be real in the first place. And now it had a contract attached to it instead of anything resembling a heartbeat. Then Walter's investigator turned up something that changed the entire shape of the story, and not in the direction anyone expected. It turned out that 3 years before I had ever nannied for Ethan, I'd briefly worked as a home health aide through a staffing agency, and one of my clients for about 4 months had been Ethan's mother. Before her first hospitalization, long before I ever knew who Ethan was, I hadn't put the pieces together because she'd gone by her maiden name with the agency, and it had been years. When Ethan found this out, he showed up at my apartment looking almost afraid. My mother knew you, he said. Before any of this happened, she actually knew you. I hadn't remembered it clearly until he said it, and even then it took me a minute. But I did remember an older woman who used to hum old church hymns while I helped her sort her medications into the little Dove wheat containers, who once told me, out of nowhere, that I had a good heart, the rare kind. Don't lose it. I hadn't known that woman was his mother until years later. Standing in his living room and seeing her photo on the mantel, and even then I never brought it up because it felt like ancient, irrelevant history that had nothing to do with anything. A week after that discovery, Ethan found a letter tucked among his mother's private papers, dated almost 2 years before she died. In it, she wrote about remembering a young aide who used to sit with her, even when she wasn't strictly required to, never once treated her like a burden the way some of the others had, and that she hoped, if her son ever found someone, it would be someone exactly like that. She didn't write my name. She didn't need to. Ethan sat with that letter in his hands for a long time before he showed it to me. I don't think any of this was really an accident, he said quietly. I think some part of her arranged this, even if she never fully understood how it would actually happen. I didn't know what to do with that information. It didn't erase the tangled mess we were standing in, the ex-wife, the board member, the trust. The fake status neither of us had corrected. But it made the whole thing feel less like a lie we'd told and more like something neither of us had fully chosen, and neither of us had fully avoided either. The custody hearing arrived anyway, letter or no letter. Renee's lawyer, exactly as promised, brought up how our relationship had supposedly started, painting it as manufactured and opportunistic. Something built around a funeral and a will instead of anything genuine. I sat in that courtroom with my face burning, listening to a stranger in a suit describe the worst possible version of what I'd done, and for a moment I genuinely thought it was going to cost Ethan custody of his own daughter. Then Grace, who was only supposed to speak briefly with the judge in chambers about her preferences, said something none of the adults had prepped her to say. She told the judge that Maya was the one who came to every single school event, who never forgot her lunch, who stayed even when things got hard at home, and that she didn't care one bit how any of it had started. She only knew that I hadn't left. The judge, who I don't think was an easy person to move emotionally, still paused for a long moment before continuing the proceedings. The case obviously didn't get decided purely on the testimony of a 7-year-old. There was far more that went into the final ruling, but it shifted something in that room. Ethan kept primary custody. The trust, as it turned out, cleared on its own separate timeline the day Grace turned 7, regardless of our relationship status. Since Patricia had actually misread an outdated draft of the clause that his mother had quietly revised before her death, none of it, in the end, had ever truly hinged on whether we were real or not. Which meant, for the first time since that funeral reception hall, there was no legal reason left. No money, no case, nothing external forcing either of us to keep pretending anything at all. Ethan showed up at my apartment door about 2 weeks after everything finally settled. No Grace with him this time, which felt unusual and made my stomach flip a little. He stood in the exact same spot he'd stood the night his mother died, and said there's nothing left riding on this anymore. No will, no hearing, no performance, for anybody watching. I just want to know honestly if you'd want to actually try. For real, no pretending involved. I stood there for a long second thinking about how many strangers had believed a lie that ended up holding more truth in it than I ever expected. Thinking about his mother humming old hymns in a chair years before any of this began. Thinking about Grace's small voice in that courtroom, about how scared I'd been of wanting something that started out this messy and complicated. I said yes. Not because it fixed everything overnight. It didn't. We're still figuring out a lot of it even now. But because for the first time in this whole strange chain of events, finally felt like an actual choice. Instead of a role I'd just quietly fallen into and never corrected, I still think about that first funeral sometimes. How easy it would have been to just say, oh, we're actually not together, the second his Aunt Carol grabbed both my hands. I don't regret not saying it. But I still wonder, honestly, what it says about me that the truest relationship I've ever had grew out of something that started as a lie nobody bothered to correct.